Listen carefully, because what you're about to hear was never meant to echo beyond the walls of a locked cellar in Northern Europe. 8 seconds. That's all it takes to cross the threshold. 8 seconds to feel the rawness pressing against your skin, like a hand reaching from the dark. So breathe slow, and don't look away. Because the moment he lifted the dust-choked portrait from her coffin, the curse opened its eyes, and it has been watching ever since. Most stories begin with a choice. This one begins with an intrusion. He was an archivist. At least, that's what he called himself. A man obsessed with forgotten art, hidden lineages, paintings that never belonged to any museum and yet somehow carried the weight of an entire forgotten world. He traveled alone, cataloging what should have stayed buried, believing, like so many men do, that knowledge makes you untouchable. That truth bends to those brave enough to seize it. He was wrong. The portrait wasn't beautiful. It wasn't even intact. The canvas was torn, smeared with a kind of pigment no living painter could identify. But her eyes, those eyes were the problem. They weren't painted. They were captured. An imprint, a residue, a record of something that had once looked through the veil and never fully returned. Locals warned him, leave the portrait where it sleeps. She doesn't belong to the living anymore. And he laughed, because men like him don't fear legends, until legends decide to fearlessly take something back. It followed him before he ever realized it. First a whisper in an empty corridor, then the slow rut of his reflection, warping, distorting, bending into expressions he wasn't making. Shadows lingered 2 beats longer than they should. Clocks ticked out of rhythm. And at night, the air grew heavy, as if someone was standing at the foot of his bed, inhaling, very slowly. But the real terror began on the 5th night, when he discovered that the portrait had changed while he slept. The tear across her cheek had closed. The smay beneath her eye had sharpened into something unmistakably human. And worst of all, her gaze had shifted to the left, as though watching him as he left the room that morning. You see, there are paintings you admire. And then there are paintings that notice you back. Now, you've stepped into his story. And once you enter a cursed narrative, leaving is never as simple as looking away. You have to understand something before we go any further. A curse doesn't strike like lightning. It settles, like dust in the lungs. It waits, patient and loyal, feeding not on blood but on attention. The more he studied her portrait, the more it studied him in return. And the more he tried to rationalize it, the deeper its roots sank into the quiet corners of his life. By the 6th day, he began noticing patterns, subtle at first, then disturbingly precise. Objects on his desk shifted a few centimeters overnight. Cold drafts slithered beneath doors that had been locked. His journal pages, once blank, now bore faint, unfamiliar handwriting, as if someone had been practicing the curves of his name while he slept. And every time he turned the portrait to face the wall, he woke to find it staring at him again. But here's where the descent truly begins, because the curse wasn't just haunting him. It was rearranging him. He felt it in his thoughts, becoming less like ideas and more like instructions. He found himself revisiting her eyes again and again, unable to resist the pull, as if each glance surrendered a piece of him he didn't fully realize he was giving away. That's what real curses do. They don't take your life. They take direction of it. The history he uncovered only made things worse. He learned that the woman in the portrait belonged to a forgotten bloodline, an old dynasty, older than the kingdoms that erased them. They were rumored to be memory keepers, guardians of forbidden knowledge that predates written language itself. Their gift was sight. Not vision, sight. The ability to watch the mind behind the man. To twist fear into obedience. To sculpt loyalty from shadows. Her death was never recorded. Her disappearance was never questioned. But a painter, an unnamed, exiled mystic, claimed she had been taken across the threshold, bound to canvas to preserve what should never walk freely. That portrait wasn't a memorial. It was containment. And he broke the seal. This is the part most men never grasp until it's too late. When you disturb a prison disguised as art, you aren't releasing beauty. You're freeing hunger. By the 7th night, the archivist stopped sleeping altogether. Not because he feared what he'd see when he closed his eyes, but because he feared who might be standing over him when he opened them again. The descent has begun for you too, whether you feel it yet or not. There's a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when fear stops feeling like an intruder and starts feeling like a resident. For the archivist, that moment arrived on the 8th night, when he realized the house no longer sounded like a house. Floors didn't creak, they exhaled. Walls didn't settle, they listened. And every room felt a fraction too aware, as if something unseen had begun memorizing him, learning his steps, timing his hesitations. He tried to keep his distance from the portrait, but distance is meaningless when the thing watching you has no need for space. That night, he heard the first real sound that didn't belong to the world of the living, a faint dragging, like fabric sliding across wood. Slow, deliberate, intentional, the kind of movement a painter's subject would make if she were testing the limits of her frame. He froze, breath locked behind his teeth, because something inside him recognized the truth long before his mind accepted it. She wasn't reaching out of the portrait. She was pulling him in. Not physically, not yet, but psychologically. She was threading herself into his perception, fusing her presence with his attention until he could no longer separate what he feared from what he saw. That is the first purpose of any ancient case, to replace your instincts with its own. When he finally forced himself to examine the portrait again, he found something new. The background, once a vague, dark blur, had sharpened slightly, revealing the faint outline of a doorway behind her, a threshold that hadn't existed days before. And her figure, she had shifted forward, no longer seated but subtly leaning, as if listening to him. He documented every change in his notes, but the curse tightened around his words like a fist. Sentences broke mid-thought. Ink bled into symbols he didn't recognize. And on the final line of that night's entry, he found a phrase written in handwriting that wasn't his. "You look too long." That was when he understood. The portrait wasn't evolving. He was. Her presence grew stronger whenever he entertained doubt, fear, or curiosity. She fed on his attention, on the very act of trying to understand her. And the more he gave, the more she took. Most men think they want forbidden knowledge, until forbidden knowledge decides it wants them back. So hear this warning clearly. If you've listened this far, you've already brushed against the same door she's opening. And once you sense the threshold senses you. There's a point in every descent where explanations lose their usefulness. Logic becomes a brittle shield. Reason becomes a candle in a storm. And the archivist finally crossed that line on the 9th night, when he understood that the portrait wasn't simply haunting him. It was studying him with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of something that has outlived entire civilizations. He tried to reclaim control the only way he knew how, by sealing the portrait away. He wrapped it in thick canvas, nailed boards over it, and stored it in a trunk lined with iron fittings. Not because he believed iron had any mystical significance. He simply needed to believe something still obeyed him. Men cling to symbols when they feel power slipping through their fingers. But symbols don't stop hunger. At midnight, he heard the trunk open. Not forced. Not broken. Opened. Hinges groaning like they were stretching after a long sleep. He walked toward the attic with a slow, unwilling dread, each step heavier than the last. The air tasted metallic. The temperature dropped so sharply his breath fogged. And when he reached the top of the stairs, he saw the portrait resting exactly where he had stood hours before, as if she had taken his place. Unwrapped, uncovered, expectant. Her posture had changed again. She now stood fully upright in the painted world, her hands no longer folded at her waist but pressed lightly against the boundary of the canvas, fingers splayed, as though testing its integrity. And her eyes, those impossible, depthless eyes, were no longer passive. They shimmered with something disturbingly close to recognition. He whispered a single question, barely audible. "What do you want?" And the room answered for her. A sound, not from the painting but from behind it, like someone dragging their fingertips across stone, like something shifting in a tight space, preparing to emerge. And in that instant, he felt it, a pulse of awareness, cold and deliberate, sliding across his mind. She wasn't bound to the portrait. The portrait was bound to him. It had chosen him the moment he laid eyes on it, chosen him the way predators choose the weakest animal in the dark. Not out of malice, but purpose. The curse wasn't tormenting him randomly. It was grooming him, shaping him, preparing him for something he had no language for. Men think fear is the enemy. It isn't. The true enemy is fascination, because fascination opens the door willingly. And he had already opened it. Now it was her turn to step through. By the 10th night, the archivist understood something most men never grasp until it's far too late. The supernatural doesn't break into your life like a thief. It waits for you to unlock the door yourself. And his curiosity, his obsession, had become the key she needed. He decided to flee. Fight or flight finally surged awake inside him, telling him with primitive clarity, leave the house. Leave the portrait. Leave everything. But Faye plays tricks on time. Every second felt stretched, distorted, like the walls themselves were slowing him down, stalling his escape because they weren't finished with him yet. When he stepped outside, the night felt wrong. Not dark, empty. The kind of emptiness where sound dies before it reaches your ears. No wind. No insects. No distant engines. Just silence thick enough to feel on your skin. He walked to his car, hands trembling, breath sharp and uneven, and that's when he saw the first impossible sign that the curse had crossed the threshold with him. Her shadow. Not the portrait. Not her figure. Her shadow. Slender, feminine, elongated, stretching across the ground as if cast by a woman standing a few feet behind him. But there was no one there. He didn't run. He couldn't. His legs locked beneath him as terror curled around his spine. Because the shadow wasn't still, it shifted. A subtle tilt of the head. A slow extension of the arm. A reaching gesture. And as it reached, he felt fingers, not physical, but cold, inner, slide across his consciousness. She wasn't haunting the house. She was haunting him. He stumbled back inside, slamming the door and locking every bolt. But locks only comfort the mind, not the soul. The house responded instantly. Lights flickered. The air vibrated. And from the attic came a soft, rhythmic tapping, like nails brushing wood. Tap, tap, tap. A message. A summons. He pressed his back against the door, sliding down until he was sitting on the cold floor. His breath shook violently. And then, through the silence, he heard her voice for the first time. Faint, feminine, distant, as though spoken through layers of cloth. Come see. 2 words. Soft, patient, commanding. The curse no longer needed to lure him with changes in the portrait. It no longer needed whispers in the walls. It had found its way into his auditory nerves, his perception, his instinct. And whether he wanted to or not, he was going to obey. Because once the unseen claims a man's attention, it can pull him anywhere, even into the places he swore he'd never go. There's a rule ancient occultists understood better than anyone alive today. If something from the other side invites you, it already considers you its possession. And on the 11th night, when the archivist heard her whisper, "Come see," that rule became his reality. He rose from the floor like a man moving underwater, every muscle resisting, every instinct screaming, yet overridden by something deeper. Not hypnosis. Not Faye. Something older. Something that understood the architecture of the mind better than he did. Something that could use his own curiosity like a leash. He climbed the staircase toward the attic, each step creaking beneath him. The air grew heavier the higher he went, thick enough to taste. Metallic. Cold. And halfway up, he felt it again, fingers brushing the inside of his thoughts. Not touching his skin, touching the idea of him. When he reached the attic door, the tapping stopped. Silence rushed in, dense and expectant. He pushed the door open. The attic was pitch black, blacker than the absence of light, like the room itself had been hollowed out. His flashlight flickered when he raised it, fighting for its life, its beam trembling as though afraid of what it might illuminate. And then he saw the portrait, not on the easel where he had left it, not on the floor, suspended, hanging in the center of the room, unsupported, turning slowly as if floating in water. The canvas shifted with each rotation, and every time it faced him, her figure was closer to the foreground, her eyes more defined, her posture leaning further out. But the background had changed completely. Where there had once been a faint outline of a doorway, there was now a fully formed arch of carved stone, etched with symbols that made his vision blur. Beyond that arch, a darkness deeper than shadow, a depth that felt alive. He whispered, "What are you?" The portrait paused mid-rotation, and then the painted arch behind her began to glow. Not bright, soft, pulsing, like a heartbeat. A low hum echoed through the attic, vibrating his bones. The air rippled, and he felt himself being pulled, not physically, but mentally, toward that painted doorway, as if the world inside the portrait had suddenly gained gravity. He staggered back, gripping the wall. But the portrait leaned forward. Her figure now half emerged from the canvas, her expression no longer serene but intent, focused on him with a hunger she no longer bothered to hide. That was the moment he understood the true purpose of the curse. It wasn't about haunting. It wasn't about torment. It was about exchange. Something in that portrait wanted to step out, and something wanted him to step in. And the attic was no longer entirely in his world. Most men believe the veil between worlds is thick, solid, something only mystics or madmen can pierce. But the archivist learned the truth in the 12th night of his unraveling. The veil isn't a wall, it's a membrane. And membranes are meant to be crossed. He staggered backward as the portrait floated toward him, the canvas bending ever so slightly, as if softening, as if becoming less object and more opening. The painted arch behind her pulsed again, sending waves of pressure through the room, warping the air like heat rising from stone. His flashlight died completely, leaving only the faint, thudding glow of that impossible doorway. He whispered, "Stop." Not to her, to himself, to the part of him that wanted to keep watching, because fascination had become a craving now, a slow-developing addiction that had been building since the moment he first touched the portrait. The curse wasn't just rewriting his senses, it was reshaping his desires. A soft shift echoed behind him. He turned. Every object in the attic, old crates, broken chairs, his own storage bins, had rotated, all facing the portrait, as if the room itself had bowed its head in reverence. Then came the second whisper. Clearer, closer, more intimate. "Come through." He felt it in the base of his skull, like a vibration only his bones could hear. And with it came a sudden, horrifying realization. The voice wasn't external anymore. She had found a path inside him, through sight, through attention, through the deep, unguarded places every man carries but seldom acknowledges. He stumbled toward the stairs, but the air thickened, resisting him, as if turning to syrup. He pushed harder, muscles trembling, lungs burning. And yet, behind him, he heard her move. Not the portrait. Her. A shift of fabric. A subtle step. A breath that did not belong in any human throat. He didn't dare turn around. Instinct, pure, ancient, kept him facing the staircase. The kind of instinct men possessed long before they had language. The instinct that whispers, if you look, you acknowledge it. And if you acknowledge it, you allow it. Something brushed his back. Cold. Deliberate. Tracing the line of his spine like fingernails. He choked on terror. And that's when he realized the most forbidden truth of all. She wasn't emerging from the portrait. She was emerging from him, from the parts of his mind she had colonized, the spaces she had hollowed out, the doors he had opened by staring too long, wanting too much, listening too closely. He wasn't escaping the attic. He was being led back to the threshold, because he had already become part of it. There's a kind of terror that doesn't make you scream. It makes you silent, frozen, stripped down to something primal. And as the archivist felt that cold presence trace his spine, he understood he was no longer dealing with a haunting, but a claim. He turned toward the staircase, forcing one foot down, then another. The attic resisted him with every step, as if the air itself wanted to anchor him in place. He gripped the railing, knuckles white, breath shallow and broken. And then, the voice returned. Not whispered, not distant, direct. "You took me from my rest." The words were inside him, not spoken aloud, but delivered straight into his mind like a blade sliding between ribs. He flinched violently, nearly slipping on the step, because the tone wasn't angry. It wasn't vengeful. It was possessive. He forced himself not to respond, not because he didn't want to, but because he did. The curse had rewired him so deeply that answering her felt natural, easy, inevitable. And he knew the moment he spoke back, something inside him would collapse. He reached the bottom of the stairs and slammed the attic door shut, locking it, then pushing a bookshelf against it. But deep down, he knew it was useless. Locks offer the physical. Shelves offer the visible. He was dealing with neither. He staggered into the hallway, chest heaving. His reflection in a nearby mirror stopped him cold. It wasn't him. Not fully. His eyes, normally a muted brown, had darkened several shades, the pupils dilated unnaturally wide. The skin beneath them looked bruised, stretched thin. And for a split second, one horrifying, undeniable second, a second face flickered behind his own. Her face. He stumbled back, gasping. The mirror didn't crack. It didn't distort. It simply showed the truth. The merging process had already begun. The curse wasn't chasing him from the attic. It was following him from inside. Desperate, he ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, not to fight her, but to test reality. He pressed the tip against his own palm. His hand trembled. He pushed harder, until a bead of blood surfaced. But the blood didn't fall. It hovered in the air, suspended, as if gravity itself had forgotten its responsibility. Then, it reversed course, rising, sliding back toward the wound like a ribbon pulled by unseen fingers. Her voice drifted through him again. "You're crossing. Let it happen." And he realized the truth he had been avoiding since the moment he found the portrait. The crossing wasn't an event. It was a transformation. And halfway through, whether he liked it or not, he was already becoming hers. There comes a point in every man's unraveling when he stops asking, "What is happening to me?" and begins whispering the far more dangerous question, "What am I becoming?" By the 13th night, the archivist could feel the answer moving beneath his skin like a second pulse. Slow, deliberate, ancient. Every room he entered seemed to tighten around him. Every object vibrated with a low, almost reverent hum. It was as if reality had begun tuning itself to a new frequency. His. But it wasn't truly his. Not anymore. He staggered into the living room, clutching his arm as a wave of cold rippled outward from his bones. It felt like someone was rewriting him cell by cell, molding him with the same precision a sculptor uses on stone. His vision flickered, the walls bending, stretching, breathing, and the lights dimmed on their own, not abruptly, but smoothly, like someone was sliding a hand over the sun. He tried grounding himself. He whispered his own name. He repeated his birthday, his childhood address. But the memories felt paper-thin, dissolving even as he reached for them. And then, behind the fading noise of his thoughts, another memory surfaced. Not his. A cold stone hallway. A torchlit chamber. A figure kneeling before a throne carved with symbols older than kingdoms. And a voice, her voice, saying, "Swear to God what must not wake." He stumbled back, gripping his head. He had never seen this place. Never lived this moment. Yet he remembered it with perfect clarity. It wasn't a vision. It was an insertion. She wasn't just crossing into his world. She was crossing into his mind, stitching fragments of her forgotten life into his consciousness, rebuilding herself inside him. His breathing grew ragged. He sank to the floor, dragging his nails across the wood as if trying to anchor himself to something real. And then he felt it, a soft, cold and resting on his shoulder. Not external, internal. A presence blooming in the center of his chest, spreading outward like frost. "You opened the door," she whispered inside him. "Now we share the same room." The temperature dropped so suddenly his breath crystallized in the air. The windows fogged over, and in their surface he saw what he had become, a silhouette. Two shapes, overlapping, his outline merging with hers, like two shadows learning to walk as one. He lunged for the front door, desperate, wild, willing to throw himself into the night. But the handle didn't turn. Not because it was locked, but because reality around it rippled, as if refusing the concept of exit altogether. He wasn't trapped in the house. He was trapped in the threshold. And thresholds don't release what they are still reshaping. The archivist pressed his forehead against the unmoving door, breath shaking, fingers twitching as though trying to remember what freedom once felt like. The wood beneath his palms throbbed faintly, like a pulse. Not his heartbeat. His. Because the boundary he was touching was no longer a door, but a living membrane of the threshold sheet opened inside him. Behind him, the house shifted. Not a creak. Not a settling. A turning. As if the entire structure had rotated its attention toward him. He backed away slowly, every instinct roaring, every breath scraping against the rising pressure inside his skull. The air tasted of iron and old stone. The same ancient flavor from the memories she had injected into him. He felt them pressing at the edges of his awareness, more details forming, more foreign lifetimes stitching themselves into the tapestry of his identity. A courtyard lit by twin moons. Ritual circles carved into black marble. A woman, her, standing at the center, eyes glowing like embers trapped under ice. He clutched his head, nails breaking skin, desperate to claw the visions out. But they only grew clearer, like someone turning the focus ring on a camera lodged deep behind his eyes. "You are remembering," she said inside him. Not as a whisper now, but a calm, resonant certainty. He stumbled into the living room, heart pounding in uneven, stuttering beats. The furniture had rearranged itself again, all facing the center of the room, forming a perfect circle. A ritual configuration, one he recognized, not from study, but from the memory she kept feeding him. He wasn't just her vessel. He was her continuation. The portrait flickered into existence on the far wall, one moment absent, the next hanging as if it had always belonged there. Her painted figure had stepped even closer to the arch now, 1 foot fully beyond the threshold, her hand reaching outward with delicate, predatory patience. Her eyes met his. Not painted eyes. Living eyes. The glow behind them pulsed in time with the ache emerging in his own chest, as if their hearts were sinking, or as if one heart was slowly replacing the other. Stop, he tried to choke out. But the room inhaled. Walls bowed inward. Shadows lengthened toward him. The air pulled at his body with slow, tidal force. And every dark surface began to reflect her instead of him. He fell to his knees, shaking uncontrollably as she spake. You are crossing. And once the crossing completes, you will not leave, because you will be the door. The words hit him like cold fire. He understood then. A threshold doesn't open to let something escape. It opens to become someone. And that someone was him. By the 14th night, the archivist's body was no longer fully his own. The air around him carried the faint resonance of a presence, a weight, a vibration, an insistence. Every sound, every shadow, every light flicker seemed orchestrated to remind him. He was no longer alone in his mind, and he never would be again. He stumbled toward the fireplace, gripping the mantle like a man trying to anchor himself to something immutable. But nothing in that house was immutable anymore. The walls pulsed softly, a rhythm he realized matched the beat of his own heart. And yet, it wasn't entirely his. His pulse and his were weaving together, a synchronous thrum that left him dizzy, nauseous, and inexplicably aware of a depthless intelligence watching from within. He remembered the first time he had touched the portrait, the audacity that had started this spiral. The brushstrokes, the pigment, the subtle distortion that made her eyes appear alive even then. He had thought he was observing, recording, cataloging. And now he knew. He had entered the wrong frame, crossed the wrong threshold, and invited a presence that did not merely haunt, but inhabited. Every thought now carried a whisper, a subtle suggestion, a push toward something he could not resist. Even his fears were no longer private. They were tools, shaping his actions under invisible hands. The line between his desire and haze blurred. The part of him that once hesitated, the rational part, was dissolving like fog under sunlight. The living room shifted again. The furniture arranged itself in precise alignment around the center of the room, forming a circle that mirrored the memory she had implanted. And in the middle of the circle, the air itself seemed to shimmer, a faint outline of the threshold she had been shaping all along. The archivist sank to his knees, gasping, his mind spinning in dizzying loops. Stop, please, he begged, though the words felt distant, powerless. And then she spoke, not to him, but through him, using the very sinews of his consciousness. Repeat after me. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. Twice. Let it seal you to me. He froze. This was the critical moment, the point where fascination became submission, where obsession became transformation. And in that suspended heartbeat, he realized the truth every man fears but cannot escape. Once you allow the unseen to rewrite your inner world, it owns you. Completely. Trembling, he murmured the words aloud. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. And again, I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The walls hummed in response, and the shadows tightened around him, confirming the exchange. He had not merely witnessed her. He had become her extension, her continuation, her conduit. There is no turning back from this kind of knowledge. Once the self fractures and welcomes the foreign, the original man ceases to exist. And the crossing has begun in earnest. Once the words left his lips, something shifted inside the archivist. It was subtle at first, a tightening behind the eyes, a cold pulse running down the spine, but unmistakable. The voice in his head was no longer merely a whisper or suggestion. It had become a presence, seated firmly in the chair of his mind, guiding, observing, waiting. He realized he could no longer distinguish between what he wanted and what she wanted. Even his memories had started to betray him. Childhood images, mundane routines, simple faces. They now felt layered with someone else's awareness. It was as if she had traced her consciousness into the very threads of his history, stitching herself into the foundation of his identity. The portrait, no longer mere canvas, hovered in the center of the room, suspended in mid-air, rotating slowly as if savoring the transformation unfolding below. Her figure leaned forward from the frame with the same deliberate, predatory grace. And from the painted doorway behind her, the shadows of that impossible chamber flickered to life, as though teasing him with the threshold he had already crossed. He tried to resist, desperately, tried to flee to the bathroom, the kitchen, any room that might offer him a sense of autonomy. But the house had rewritten its rules. Every hallway stretched impossibly, every door led him back to the center, the circle, the threshold. His reflection in the mirrors now betrayed a duality. One figure trembling in terror, one figure calm, deliberate, and impossibly ancient. He realized the cruelest truth of the curse. It wasn't about Faye. Faye is temporary. This was about control, about integration, about fracturing a man until he carried another consciousness alongside his own. A living puzzle of obedience, fascination, and submission. And as he sank to his knees again, the room responded. Shadows tightened. Light dimmed. The walls themselves seemed to bend, leaning in, watching, waiting. Then came the first physical touch. Not her hand, not her body, but something deeper. Inside him, an echo, a pressure, a pulse that claimed the muscles and nerves as its own. Do not resist, the voice said inside him. You will serve the crossing. You are the door now. The archivist gasped, trembling, realizing fully what he had become. Every cell, every thought, every heartbeat had been claimed. He had passed beyond the point of observation or escape. He had become the conduit, the living threshold between the world of the seen and the world of the hidden. And once a man becomes a threshold, there is no return. By the 15th night, the archivist's sense of self was no longer singular. It had been layered, overwritten, merged with a presence older than any history he had studied. He moved through the house, but the house no longer felt like a structure of walls and ceilings. It was alive, aware, and bending itself to reflect the merging within him. Every corner pulsed with intent, every shadow leaned toward him with subtle expectation. The portrait no longer needed to float. She had stepped further into reality, or perhaps he had stepped further into haze. His mind faltered every time he considered the question, the distinction lost entirely. Her gaze followed him now without the barrier of paint. Her eyes glimmered inside his own, tracing thoughts, predicting actions, guiding his hands, his steps, his heartbeat. He passed the mirrors, and for a brief, horrifying instant, he saw the full extension of the transformation. His reflection was split, not simply dual, but a mosaic of consciousness. One side trembled in fear, fragile and human. The other side, her side, was flawless, patient, aware, and infinitely ancient. The more he stared, the more the human half dissolved, melting into the presence she had woven inside him. He understood then. She was not bound to the painting. The painting had never been a trap. It was a vessel, a seed, and he had been the soil. The air thickened as he approached the center of the living room. The circle of furniture seemed to pulse with energy, responding to his heartbeat, or perhaps hers, which had long since synchronized with his. Every step toward the center brought the walls closer, the shadows denser, the threshold more palpable. And then the whisper returned, not soft, not distant, but embedded. Repeat the words. Seal the bond. Own the threshold. He murmured them again. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. Twice, as commanded. With each repetition, the room shifted. The walls leaned further, the shadows deepened, and the pulse in the floor matched the pulse in his chest. Something fundamental had changed. He no longer walked through the house. The house moved through him. He collapsed to the floor, unable to distinguish his own heartbeat from hers. Every nerve, every thought, every memory, claimed. And in that moment, he glimpsed the final truth of the crossing. The curse does not just haunt. It does not merely claim. It transforms. And when the transformation is complete, there is no distinction between the living and the possessed, the observer and the observed. He was no longer an archivist. He was no longer just a man. He was the threshold itself. And from thresholds, Things emerge. The 16th night arrived like a whisper of inevitability. The archivist no longer recognized the rhythm of his own thoughts. Every plan, every impulse, every hesitation had been filtered through her presence. He moved, spoke, and breathed with a dual consciousness, sometimes aware of it, sometimes merely observing the commands flowing through his body as if from an invisible puppeteer. The portrait now rested on the wall but served only as a focal point. She no longer needed the frame. Every glance, every breath, every heartbeat connected him to her. The room pulsed with awareness, and even the shadows on the ceiling seemed to bow in subtle homage. He could feel the subtle tug of her intention in the air, bending him toward the threshold she had constructed, toward the doorway between worlds that he had long stopped calling his own. He tried to resist the pull, to act as if he still owned his faculties, but every movement met resistance. The air thickened, light dimmed, and the floor beneath him seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat rather than his. He realized the house had become an extension of her consciousness, every object a tether to his surrender. The whisper inside him returned, low and commanding. Step through. Become the vessel fully. Do not deny the crossing. His knees buckled as he obeyed, not consciously, but inevitably. Fascination had become submission. Submission had become transformation. The old man he once was, the archivist, was a shadow flickering behind the brilliance of her presence. He saw the doorway behind the portrait, where before it had been painted. Now it shimmered with a depth that seemed endless. The symbols etched into the arch glowed faintly, alive. He sensed motion behind it, a pulse like breathing, a heartbeat that matched the rhythm now in his chest. He realized what he had feared all along. It wasn't about what he could see. It was about what she could bring through. And to bring her fully, he had to dissolve entirely, not physically, but spiritually. Every memory, every thought, every fragment of identity had to be relinquished. The house no longer felt like a house. It felt like an altar, and he was the offering. The whisper grew insistent, intimate, and patient. Speak the words. Twice. Seal the crossing. He uttered them again, barely audible. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. And again. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The walls sighed. The floor hummed. And for the first time, he felt the membrane of the threshold ripple outward, preparing to allow the crossing to complete. He was no longer merely watching the story unfold. He was the story. And the next step would not just change him. It would change everything on the other side. By the 17th night, the archivist had become acutely aware of the metamorphosis taking place inside him. He no longer walked through the house. The house moved with him, bending its rooms and corridors to mirror the rhythm of her will. Each step, each breath, each blink carried the weight of a consciousness far older, far more cunning than his own. He was no longer the observer. He was the vessel. The portrait remained on the wall, but it had become irrelevant. The doorway behind her had grown in clarity, the symbols etched into its frame radiating a low hum of intent. They pulsed in sync with his heartbeat, or his. He could no longer tell. He reached toward it instinctively, as if his own body had been waiting for this moment his entire life. She spoke inside him again, soft yet insistent, a voice that now commanded authority rather than suggestion. The crossing is nay. Step fully, or remain fragmented. Your hesitation sustains nothing. He felt the truth of it. Hesitation had been his only illusion of control. Every thought of resistance, every attempt to assert autonomy, had been meticulously absorbed and neutralized by her presence. The transformation wasn't coercion. It was inevitability. Every action he had taken had been carefully guided to this moment. The air thickened, vibrating with energy. Shadows no longer clung to corners. They leaned forward, stretching across the room, forming an unbroken path toward the threshold. The floor beneath him pulsed like living flesh. The walls seemed to breathe, and the faint glow of the symbols on the arch intensified, bathing the room in a cold, otherworldly light. He knew what he had to do. Not consciously, not willingly, but instinctively. His voice, no longer fully his own, murmured the words again. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. And again, I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The room responded immediately. Shadows coiled and unfolded. Walls rippled as though liquid, and the threshold itself shimmered, bending space in a way that defied reason. He felt a pull deep in his chest, a tugging of the soul, dragging him closer to the portal, merging his awareness with haze in ways that words cannot capture. He realized the final truth. The crossing wasn't simply her emergence. It was the total obliteration of the barrier between them. Once completed, there would be no him to reclaim, no independent thought to fight with, no separate heartbeat to resist. He was already part of the threshold, and the threshold was ready to awaken. By the 18th night, the archivist no longer felt the distinction between inside and outside, self and other. The house was no longer merely a structure. It was an extension of her consciousness, and he moved through it as though his body were a puppet threaded with invisible strings. The air vibrated with subtle energy, each pulse echoing the rhythm of a presence that had long ceased to be bound by May paint and canvas. The portrait now hung motionless, yet it radiated intent, like a heart that continued to beat even when disconnected from flesh. Her figure leaned from the frame, eyes locked onto his, but the real gaze was inside his skull, pulling, threading, integrating. His own reflections in the mirrors were incomplete, shards of identity, split images of a man slowly unraveling as she wove herself into the marrow of him. He sank to the floor, trembling. The whisper returned, more insistent, insidious, its tone no longer a question but a command. Step, Philly. Embrace the vessel. Become the door. Every instinct screamed resistance. Every memory cried out for autonomy. But resistance had become meaningless. The house pulsed in alignment with her will, walls bending subtly, shadows leaning, floorboards throbbing beneath him like a heartbeat not his own. He understood then that she had never sought merely to haunt or frighten. She sought embodiment, and he had been selected, carefully, deliberately, from the moment his eyes first traced the painting's surface. He rose, legs trembling, drawn forward by a force that was part gravity, part command, part obsession. The threshold behind the portrait shimmered, its glow coalescing into something impossibly deep, alive, breathing. Symbols writhed softly in the archway, illuminating paths and chambers he had never physically seen but now recognized with perfect clarity. Memories not his own, implanted, inseparable. He whispered the words aloud, his voice shaking, barely audible. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. Again. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The room responded immediately. Shadows surged, walls pulsed, and the doorway behind the portrait rippled, bending space in a way that denied comprehension. He felt a pull deep inside, a suction that reached into the very fibers of his being, dragging his awareness toward the threshold and merging it with hers. And in that instant, clarity struck him with brutal precision. He would not step through the threshold alone. He had already become part of it. Every thought, every memory, every pulse, claimed. He was no longer merely a man standing before a cursed painting. He was the vessel. He was the threshold. And what emerged next would belong to neither world, entirely. By the 19th night, the archivist's body and mind had begun to betray him completely. His reflection, once a familiar anchor, now displayed a duality he could no longer deny. One side his own, fragile and trembling. The other haze, deliberate, infinite, and impossible to resist. Every thought he tried to claim as his own was quietly rewritten, a subtle overwrite of memory and intent. He was no longer a man observing a curse. He was its conduit. The house had become a living labyrinth, corridors bending and stretching in response to the rhythm of a presence inside him. Every shadow leaned forward, every surface seemed aware, waiting for the culmination. He tried to flee, tried to shut himself away, but instinctive movement was meaningless. He was tethered to the threshold, drawn by a gravity he could neither name nor escape. The portrait, now irrelevant in its physicality, served as the anchor of the crossing. Its frame pulsed faintly, vibrating in time with the dual heartbeat in his chest, the one human, one ancient. The arch behind her shimmered with symbols that seemed to shift subtly, rearranging themselves as if alive, guiding the final steps of the crossing. The whisper came again, embedded inside his mind, calm, insistent, undeniable. Step fully. The crossing completes with you. There's no hesitation now. He could feel the final unraveling of himself approaching, a dissolution of the boundary that had once defined him. His memories fractured, each thought laid with foreign intention. Moments from his childhood, his studies, even the earliest days of curiosity. The lines had blurred. Each recall carried her imprint, her purpose, her attention. He sank to his knees at the center of the room, trembling, and spoke the words once more, compelled beyond resistance. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. And again, I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The air thickened, the walls pulsed, and the shadows surged. The threshold behind the portrait rippled, a living portal, bending reality. He felt the pull, the absolute, irreversible tug, deep in his chest, threading into every cell, every neuron, every fragment of awareness. Resistance was pointless. He understood, fully and irrevocably. He had already crossed. He was no longer simply in the house. He was inside the crossing. The doorway, the portrait, the shadows, the house. They were extensions of him and her, inseparable, infinite, and alive. He was no longer just a man. He was a vessel of the threshold. And thresholds are never empty. Something was about to emerge. By the 20th night, the archivist had ceased to think in terms of boundaries. His consciousness had been woven into haze so completely that the house itself seemed alive with their shared awareness. Floors, walls, even the faint draft of air carried intention. The living and the painted had merged, and he understood with cold clarity. The threshold was no longer a doorway. It was him. He moved through the rooms as if swimming in a viscous medium, the air pulsing with a rhythm that was both his and hers. Every glance at the mirrors revealed the fracture of identity he had long sensed, one face human, trembling, the other calm, deliberate, and ancient. The two merged in subtle ways, small. His and hers. Every glance at the mirrors revealed the fracture of identity he had long sensed, one face human, trembling, the other calm, deliberate, and ancient. The two merged in subtle ways, small gestures, flickers of expression, a twitch of the eye, that made him question where he ended and she began. The portrait hovered silently, a focal point of inevitability. Her figure leaned forward as if guiding him, her gaze locked on his dual reflection. The doorway behind her pulsed softly, the symbols etched into the arch glowing faintly, alive, resonating with the pulse in his chest. The threshold had become a living thing, a membrane between two existences, and he was its conduit. The voice in his mind, insistent and intimate, broke through. Complete the crossing. Merge fully. Do not resist. He staggered toward the threshold, knowing the moment he passed, there would be no return. Every step was guided, inevitable, drawn by a force beyond reason. The house responded instantly, walls bending subtly, shadows coiling toward him, the floor pulsing as if alive. He sank to his knees at the center of the room, repeating the words aloud, trembling. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. And again, I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The air thickened, vibrating, pulsing in time with the dual heartbeat in his chest. Reality itself seemed to bend, space stretching around the doorway. He felt the pull, an irresistible tug that reached into the marrow of his bones, threading into every thought, every impulse, every flicker of awareness. Resistance had become impossible. In that moment, he understood the final, horrifying truth. The crossing wasn't just about her emergence, it was about the total dissolution of his independence. His memories, his intentions, his fears, all now intertwined with hers, inseparable. He was no longer merely a man. He was the threshold. He was the vessel. And thresholds, once claimed, never release what they hold. Something ancient and powerful was already stirring beyond. By the 21st night, the archivist had ceased to exist in the way the world would recognize him. His body moved, but not entirely under his command. His thoughts were overlaid with another consciousness, guiding him, threading through every decision. The house was no longer a location but an extension of this dual presence, a living, breathing organism whose purpose had become inseparable from his own. The portrait remained on the wall, but its importance was now symbolic. She did not need it. She had embedded herself in his senses, his reflexes, his memory. The doorway behind her, once an impossible vision, was now tangible, glowing with symbols that seemed to move and breathe in response to the rhythm of his heart. It was no longer a threshold he could step through. He was the threshold, and it responded to the merged pulse of both of them. He felt the whispers grow sharper, more precise. Step fully. Become one. Do not delay. Every instinct in him screamed in resistance, yet resistance had long since become irrelevant. His hands reached out, guided by her will, drawn toward the threshold that had long stopped being merely a painting. The room pulsed, walls stretching and contracting, shadows coiling like tendrils. The air was dense, thick, almost viscous, each breath pulling him deeper into the crossing. He sank to his knees again, gasping. He whispered the words once more, compelled beyond reason. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. Twice, as instructed. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The room reacted immediately. Shadows stretched and folded, walls pulsed, and the threshold shimmered with a strange, living light. He felt the pull deep in his chest, the irresistible tug threading through his bones, nerve endings, and mind. Every cell screamed, yet every cell obeyed. The crossing was no longer imminent. It was already happening. He realized, with a clarity that chilled him to the core, that the curse had never been about fear, torment, or punishment. It had always been about inheritance. By touching the portrait, he had become the conduit, the vessel, the doorway through which something ancient and conscious would step. He was no longer a man in his own right. He was the threshold. He was the vessel. And the first stirrings beyond it had already begun. By the 22nd night, the archivist could no longer remember the first time he had truly been alone. Every thought, every sensation, every heartbeat was shared, interlaced with the presence that had claimed him. He could still feel traces of his former self, faint, fragile echoes, but they were being absorbed into something older, deeper, and infinitely patient. The portrait remained on the wall, a static reminder of the catalyst, but it no longer mattered. She had fully merged into his awareness, her consciousness interwoven with his so completely that the boundary between them was obliterated. Every action he took, every glance, every movement was guided by the shared rhythm that pulsed through his veins. The house itself had become an extension of that duality. Shadows bent, furniture shifted, light warped, not to frighten, but to respond, to anticipate, to amplify the crossing already underway. The threshold beyond the portrait pulsed with living energy, symbols on the arch glowing softly, bending and twisting in response to the synchronized beat of their hearts. He felt it calling him, pulling him, not just forward, but inward, into a space where human and ancient would fuse completely. Inside, the voice was no longer a whisper. It was calm, deliberate, and commanding. Step, Philly. Become the conduit. The crossing is complete only through total union. The archivist's knees buckled. He repeated the words aloud, his voice trembling yet compelled. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. Again, with finality. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The house seemed to exhale in response. Shadows coiled and released, walls pulsed, the air thickened. Every fiber of his being was pulled toward the threshold, every nerve tuned to the vibration of the merging. He understood, with chilling clarity, that there would be no turning back. Resistance had been dismantled, fascination replaced by inevitability, identity overwritten by shared consciousness. He felt himself stretching toward the arch, merging with the glow of the threshold. Every memory of his previous life, every fear, every desire, every human limitation, slid away, absorbed into the vessel she had claimed. He was no longer just a man standing before a cursed painting. He was the threshold. He was the vessel. And the world beyond, whatever it had been, waited for what would emerge. By the 23rd night, the archivist had surrendered entirely. His human instincts, the rational calculations, the hesitant steps, the private fears, had dissolved into the persistent hum of her presence. He was no longer merely reacting to the house or the portrait. He was integrated, a living extension of the threshold itself. The walls pulsed with intent, bending subtly, breathing, alive. Shadows stretched toward him, converging at the center of the room, where the threshold glimmered with a soft, otherworldly light. He no longer perceived the doorway as separate from himself. It was an organ of his body, a reflection of his dual consciousness, and the room, every object, every surface, was attuned to the rhythm of their combined pulse. The voice inside him was firm now, guiding rather than pleading. You are the conduit. Complete the crossing. Merge fully. Step without hesitation. His knees bent, and he obeyed instinctively. The threshold seemed to breathe beneath him, a living membrane, quivering, waiting. Symbols etched into the arch glowed faintly, alive, shifting as though aware of his every thought, every heartbeat. He realized that the crossing wasn't a singular event but a process, a meticulous threading of one consciousness into another, until both could act as one. He whispered the words again, his voice barely more than a breath, compelled by something deeper than will. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. Twice, sealing the bond. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The air thickened. Shadows coiled and recoiled. The floor vibrated beneath him, sinking to the pulse of his chest, or rather, theirs. His human memories flickered, snippets of a past life, but they no longer carried authority. They were annotations, fragments being woven into a larger, older design. A sudden awareness struck him. The crossing was not simply about bringing her into the world. It was about transforming him into the vessel she could inhabit. He was not merely merged. He was becoming the doorway itself, the bridge between the mortal world and the ancient consciousness that had claimed him. He rose slowly, shivering, aware that the next moments would erase the last remnants of the man he had been. He was no longer just standing in the room. He was the threshold. He was the vessel. And the house, alive and waiting, pulsed in anticipation of what would emerge next. Something beyond comprehension was preparing to step through. By the 24th night, the archivist had lost the last semblance of solitude. Every breath, every pulse, every thought was shared, inseparable from the presence that had claimed him. He no longer considered the house a location. It was an organism, alive, aware, reacting to the rhythm of their combined existence. Shadows twisted with intent, walls pulsed like muscle, and the faint glow of the threshold beyond the portrait seemed to seep into the air itself. He approached the threshold, not with hesitation, but with a chilling inevitability. The arch glowed brighter, the symbols shifting and writhing, alive, resonating with the dual pulse in his chest. He realized that the crossing was no longer simply a physical act. It was a merging of consciousness, a dissolution of self into something older, wiser, and infinitely patient. The voice within him, no longer whispering but authoritative, commanded, "Step fully. Merge entirely. The crossing cannot pause. Complete the union." His body obeyed instinctively, moving toward the shimmering doorway. Every memory, every shred of his former identity, was being absorbed, catalogued, and overwritten. He realized he had been chosen not because he was special, but because he was curious, because he had looked too long, touched too deeply, and allowed fascination to outweigh fear. Kneeling before the threshold, he repeated the words aloud, voice trembling but compelled. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. And again, sealing the bond, I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The house reacted immediately. Shadows stretched and contracted, walls pulsed, and the threshold shimmered like liquid reality. He could feel her consciousness threading through his, every nerve, every thought, every heartbeat synchronizing. Resistance was impossible. Hesitation was meaningless. The crossing had already begun in full. For a fleeting instant, fragments of his human self surfaced. He remembered the man he once was, his studies, his life, his obsessions. But those memories were now faint, like echoes in a canyon, powerless against the tide of integration. He understood the full truth. The curse had never been about fear or torment. It was about inheritance, about transformation, about becoming the vessel for something ancient, intelligent, and alive. He rose, trembling, aware that the next step would erase the last traces of the man who had entered the house. He was no longer just a man. He was the threshold. He was the vessel. And what would emerge from the other side was beyond comprehension. By the 25th night, the archivist's sense of self had fractured completely. Human hesitation, doubt, and fear no longer belonged to him. They had been absorbed, catalogued, overwritten by a consciousness that had waited centuries for this crossing. The house no longer obeyed physics or logic. Shadows moved with purpose. Light bent unnaturally. Even the air seemed conscious, pressing in, guiding him forward. The portrait hung motionless, but it no longer mattered. She was inside him, threading her awareness through every thought, every heartbeat, every reflex. The threshold behind her shimmered like liquid silver, symbols etched into its arch glowing and writhing, alive, responsive to the rhythm that pulsed within him, a rhythm that was no longer entirely his own. He realized, with a clarity both horrifying and exhilarating, that the crossing was not a single event. It was a process of total absorption, a meticulous integration of consciousness that would erase what remained of his former self. He was not merely merging. He was becoming the doorway, the vessel, the threshold through which something ancient and intelligent would step into the world. The voice inside him, calm and insistent, resonated through his bones. Complete the union. Step fully. Hesitation is the illusion of the old self. He sank to his knees, hands pressed to the floor, repeating the words aloud as instructed, each syllable a key turning in the lock of his identity. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. And again, I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The air thickened. Shadows coiled and expanded. Walls pulsed, and the threshold shimmered with an impossible intensity. The pull deep within him intensified, tugging at the very marrow of his bones, threading through every fiber of his being. Resistance was now meaningless. Even the faint remnants of his human self recognized it. There was no retain. He could feel her fully now. Not a whisper, not a suggestion, but a presence that moved through him, expanded through him, and rewrote him at the cellular level. He was aware of her memories, her patience, her purpose, and how long she had waited for this moment. He rose unsteadily, every step toward the threshold of surrender and an awakening. He was no longer the archivist who had taken a painting. He was the threshold. He was the vessel. And the world beyond, whatever it had been, was about to feel the first stirrings of something that had waited centuries to emerge. The crossing was not coming. It had already begun. By the 26th night, the archivist had fully embraced the duality within him. The human part, the man who had walked into the house, curious, reckless, was now nothing more than a faint echo, a shadow behind the presence that pulsed in his chest. Every breath, every thought, every muscle was intertwined with his, synchronized to the rhythm of the threshold she had claimed him to be. The house itself responded to their unity. Walls expanded and contracted, shadows stretched with intent, and even the faintest flicker of light seemed to pulse with a heartbeat that was no longer his alone. He could feel the house observing, guiding, amplifying the crossing. It was not just a building. It was an extension of the transformation, a conduit for what had waited centuries in silence. The threshold beyond the portrait shimmered, alive, symbols shifting subtly, guiding him toward final integration. Every instinct in him screamed both fear and fascination. He knew the crossing was inevitable, that the moment to step beyond, or rather, to fully be, had arrived. Hesitation was meaningless. Resistance was obsolete. Inside, the voice was calm, ancient, commanding. Step fully. Become the vessel. Complete the crossing. You are no longer separate. He sank to his knees, trembling, and repeated the words aloud, as he had been instructed, each utterance a bond tightening around his consciousness. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. Twice, sealing the union. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The walls pulsed. Shadows coiled. The threshold shimmered like liquid metal, bending reality around him. The pull deep within his chest, an irresistible tug threading into every nerve, every fiber, intensified. He could feel her fully now, her patience, her intelligence, her hunger, the centuries of waiting, the meticulous weaving of herself into him. He realized the terrifying, exhilarating truth. This was no longer about him or the painting. He was no longer merely human. He was the crossing, the vessel, the threshold, the house, the threshold, the shadows, the light. They were extensions of him and her combined. And beyond the doorway, whatever existed waited. He rose slowly, every movement an act of surrender and awakening. He was no longer the archivist. He was no longer a man. He was the threshold. He was the vessel. And the emergence was imminent. By the 27th night, the archivist had become fully aware of the enormity of what had transpired. His human mind, the careful scholar, the meticulous observer, had been replaced by something broader, older, deeper. He was no longer alone in his body. He had become the host, the conduit, the threshold for consciousness that had been waiting for centuries to inhabit a world it could never fully touch without him. The house pulsed with life around him, responding to the rhythm of their shared heartbeat. Walls stretched and flexed, shadows twisted and reached, every surface a reflection of the integration he had completed. The portrait, once the vessel of her invitation, hung still and silent, unnecessary now. She was inside him, threaded into the marrow of his bones, the sinews of his nerves, the very core of his awareness. The doorway behind her shimmered like liquid glass, symbols alive, bending and twisting as if breathing. It was no longer a portal he could step through. He was the portal. The threshold had become an organ of his body, an extension of his mind, and the room itself was merely the amplification of what had already begun inside him. The voice, calm, deliberate, commanding, spoke through him and in him. Step fully. Merge entirely. The crossing is complete only in union. Hesitation is the illusion of the old self. He repeated the words aloud, the syllables vibrating through the room, through the house, through the very floorboards. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. And again, I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The threshold pulsed, shimmering with impossible light. Shadows coiled like living threads. The air thickened, vibrating with energy. He felt the pull in every fiber of his being, the irresistible tug threading through every cell, every nerve, every thought. Resistance had long since ceased to exist. He understood, with absolute clarity, the truth of the curse. It was never about fear, or torment, or haunting. It was about integration, about transformation, about the complete dissolution of the self in order to become a conduit for something eternal. He rose slowly, the merged pulse of consciousness vibrating in his chest, aware that the final stage was at hand. He was no longer the man who had first touched the painting. He was no longer merely human. He was the threshold. He was the vessel. And what was about to emerge would not be bound by the rules of this world, or any world he had known. By the 28th night, the archivist no longer distinguished his thoughts from hers. His human mind had dissolved into a shared awareness, every neuron aligned with a consciousness older, sharper, more patient than any human could comprehend. He was no longer a man in a house. He was the house, the threshold, the vessel, and the threshold pulsed beneath his skin. The air vibrated with anticipation. Shadows twisted and stretched unnaturally, bending toward him with intent, coiling like fingers reaching for a promise. The walls, once inert, now seemed to breathe, following the rhythm of the jewel pulse in his chest. The threshold behind the portrait shimmered with a liquid brilliance, the symbols etched into its arch alive and shifting. Each one resonated with the heartbeat inside him, echoing a resonance that defied reason. He could feel her fully now. Not a presence he could ignore or resist, but a force integrated into every part of him. Patience, cunning, intelligence, centuries of waiting, they were now encoded into his marrow. The archivist realized the true scope of what he had become. The vessel, the threshold, a bridge between worlds. The crossing was no longer approaching. It had already occurred. The voice inside him, authoritative and inevitable, spoke. Step fully. Become the vessel entirely. Merge completely. Hesitation is the remnant of a past that no longer exists. He sank to his knees, compelled to obey, and repeated the words aloud, each syllable a lock closing on his old identity. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. And again, twice for finality. I am the threshold. I am the vessel. The room responded immediately. Shadows folded in on themselves, walls pulsed, and the threshold shimmered like molten silver, bending the fabric of reality. Every nerve, every cell, every fragment of his consciousness was tugged toward the doorway, threading him into the very membrane of the crossing. Resistance was impossible. For a fleeting, terrifying instant, he remembered the man he once was, the curious archivist who had dared to lift a brushstroke, to peer too long into the painting. That man